This is the Whimsy Farm Podcast. I'm Carolyn Crane.
There's a big wide world right out your door. Good people doing good things. Whoa, it's a big wide world. Now is the time. Now is our time.
Welcome, everyone. In this fast-spinning news cycle that is the overwhelming reality of media today, there are dizzying distractions. From sex scandals to failing escalators, we often lose focus of what might be happening that is less sexy, less sensational, yet much more important. With that in mind, today we spend an hour with independent investigative journalist Antonia Juhasz, a regular contributing politics reporter to Rolling Stone, where she writes feature articles focused on energy, climate, and environmental justice. She's also written for the New York Times, Atlantic, National Geographic, Guardian, Wired, and many other outlets. She is the author of 3 books: Black Tide, The Devastating Impact of the Gulf Oil Spill, The Tyranny of Oil, and The Bush Agenda. She has also contributed to 9 additional books, including, most recently in 2023, Rebecca Solnit and Thelma Young's Lutunatabua's Not Too Late, Changing the Climate Story from Despair to Possibility. Introducing Juhasz in his 2020 interview with her in The New Yorker, Bill McKibbon wrote that she was a 2021 Bertha Investigative Journalism Fellow, working with an international cohort of journalists on fossil fuels, the climate crisis, and corporate power. Her most recent article in Rolling Stone is titled Inside the Fight Against Trump's Alaskan Pipe Dream, and that's the focus of our talk today. Antonia Juhasz, welcome to the Whimsy Farm Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Carolyn. It's great to be on with you and great to see you again.
It's great to see you again, too. So on August 13th, you attended the summit in Anchorage where Trump hosted Putin. And you write in the article that the summit, quote, did little to advance peace in Ukraine, but did further both presidents' commitment to fossil-fueled autocracy. Can you tell us a bit about the summit and the impressions it made on you?
Sure. That was an entire separate article. So I first wrote an article on the summit, and wrote that shortly after getting back from Alaska. And the summit was truly, historic in all the wrong ways. Putin came to the United States, even though he's a wanted war criminal, and but Trump welcomed him onto U.S. soil. Trump had threatened many conditions. First, of there wouldn't even be a summit unless Putin met certain conditions, which would help, which were supposed to help lead towards a path towards peace in Ukraine. Putin didn't meet any of those conditions, but the summit was held anyway. Trump then threatened conditions of if, once at the summit, if certain things weren't agreed to, things that would happen, and those conditions weren't met. Trump has, basically what did happen at the summit, which was rather short, was negotiations took place that could further facilitate large U.S. oil companies' potential return to Russia, which is something both they and the Russians greatly want, and to further lock in potential Russian dominance over Ukraine's fossil fuel and other natural resources. And the summit concluded with a press briefing that was also quite strange, which I attended, which Putin entered first. He led the press conference. Of course, he was speaking in Russian, and we had simultaneous translation as the press there. But if you were just watching it, the vast majority of the press conference was in Russian because Putin spoke first. He dominated almost the entire press conference. And then he introduced Trump, who spoke for a short period of time, and mostly talked about his great friendship with Putin, and that they had, were forging paths towards peace in Ukraine. But of course, Zelensky was not invited to that meeting. Prior to the meeting, I did attend and report on protests that were held by Ukrainians living in Alaska and also Alaskans supporting them, who were, you know, extremely skeptical of what was going to happen, and were correct in their skepticism that they had predicted leading up to the summit, which was that not only did it not advance peace, the Russians have increased their assault on Ukraine in the wake of the summit. Putin was emboldened by the summit, shown that he was, a world leader who was not, instead of being shunned, was being welcomed, that he, instead of being shunned, was seen as a partner to Trump. And Putin has acted essentially accordingly. There had been rumors that there would then be a follow-up meeting, or not rumors, Trump said there would be a follow-up meeting with the three of them shortly thereafter, which didn't take place. Zelensky did come to the White House and meet with Trump himself shortly thereafter, but there was not a promised meeting either between Zelensky and Putin, or Trump, Zelensky, and Putin. And as I said in the piece that you had quoted, there was certainly an advance made on these fossil fuel negotiations, both for the future of Ukraine's fossil fuels and also the future of bringing Russia back into the broader commercial market that it wants to be in to feed its war machine, which is to be able to sell its oil and gas and to bring U.S. companies back in. I'll just say really quickly, I know I've talked on for a little bit. Trump made some interesting moves in even the past week, seeming to support sanctions on Russian oil and gas, calling for other nations to reduce their consumption of Russian oil and gas. But again, he hasn't followed that up with anything more than words. Those could be significant words, but we'll see, what actually comes of it.
Thanks for that. That was a wonderful recap. But one of the things you mentioned is, while you all were in Anchorage, the capital of Alaska, Juneau, was under evacuation. Can you tell us about that?
Alaska, and particularly the Alaskan Arctic, is warming at rates of almost 4 times the rest of the world's warming rates. And Alaska is itself, more broadly, is warming at rates of 2 to 3 times the rest of the world. Global warming is, of course, the outcome primarily of the burning and use of fossil fuels, leading to global warming, leading to the climate crisis. Alaska's rapid warming rate is also leading its glaciers to melt faster than in any other place in the world. And glacier melt, as I was told, so after the summit, so during the summit, as you said, 2 of Alaska's glaciers outside of the capital city of Juneau were experiencing what now has become continuous flooding, but this year was the worst flooding to date. And its residents were given an evacuation, or residents, not all of them, but residents were given an evacuation order to get out of the way of the melting glaciers. This is getting worse and worse. Juneau has put in place some adaptation measures to try and protect its citizens from this increasingly worsening situation. But the main problem that they're facing is that we continue to put exorbitant amounts of fossil fuel pollution into the air, and that continues to warm the planet, and the glaciers continue to melt apace. The glacier melt, as I was told when I went on a trip a few days after the summit to see another glacier that is melting. I was there with a woman who's a scientist who studies glaciers, and she explained glaciers are supposed to melt. That happens, but there's supposed to be enough cold and snow to replenish what's being melted off. And because there's too much warmth, there isn't enough cold and snow to replenish them. And so they are melting. And that not only makes the residents of Juneau have to evacuate to outrun these floods, but it also reduces the amount of fresh water available to us as humans. It also contributes to, of course, rising sea levels. And as one advocate in Alaska said to me, our melting glaciers are New York's rising seas, and there's no way around it.
Wow. Thank you. You write that on the first day of his second term in office, I'm quoting you, Trump signed an expansive executive order entitled Unleashing Alaska's Extraordinary Resource Potential. 219 executive orders have followed, but Alaska remains the one and only state to receive such unique and unprecedented attention. So it was the very first executive order and the only one to name a state. What's going on with that?
It wasn't the first executive order, but it was on the first day. Remember, he did this slew
Oh,
of
right.
executive orders on the first day. And one was declaring a national energy emergency. Another was removing the US from the Paris Climate Accords. And this Alaska resources executive order. Alaska is the only state that's gotten this attention, as I said, and it did happen on the very first day. And from the day that that executive order was signed, I wanted to find out why. You know, what is he up to in Alaska, and why is it receiving this intense focus? And the executive order is expansive and essentially is Trump putting his quote unquote national energy dominance agenda into practice in a state where he can, because so much of Alaska is owned by the federal government. It's unique in this way. And it is a state that is not only dominated by the federal government, it's dominated by the fossil fuel industry. And the fossil fuel industry is, a key, if not the key political player in the state. And Trump was using this order as an opportunity, and it's then been played out through subsequent legislation that Republicans have passed and actions taken by agencies to enforce it, is to double oil production in the state, to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to drilling, to open up what's called the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, which sounds like it's just one big oil field, but it's actually an extremely large area where Native communities live, where Native communities depend on the natural resources there, like all of Alaska, an incredibly beautiful and rich ecosystem. And of course, I skipped over it, but for those who don't know, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is also incredibly beautiful and a place where Native Alaskans depend on for their life. The order would also push what would be the largest fossil fuel infrastructure project in the entire country, which is an 800-mile long pipeline from the tip of Alaska down to the bottom of Alaska to move gas from the top of the Alaskan Arctic down to past Anchorage to a little community of Nikiski, where I also visited off the Cook Inlet, and to build a massive new a facility that cools that gas to prepare it for export and then export it out to Asia. So a massive new, what's called liquefied natural gas facility. All of this is to lock Alaska and the nation further into fossil fuels, while also subsequent laws and actions the Trump administration have taken, of course, are to aggressively kneecap or undo any financial commitments the federal government has made to renewable energy. So to get rid of the competition that's currently winning against the fossil fuel industry and to try and kneecap it and get it out of the game. And to do that in Alaska, which is also a state that is working hard to embrace renewables, and basically creating this sort of test case for the rest of the nation. And to tie it back to where we started with Putin, Trump told us before he took office who his friends and allies are. He admires autocrats and dictators. And one of the autocrats and dictators that he admires the most is Putin. He also admires Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. He imagines the US as an fossil fueled autocracy like Russia and Saudi Arabia, but also to be in a club with Russia and Saudi Arabia, which is three powerful nations committed to the world's commitment to fossil fuels. In Russia and Saudi Arabia, those are state-controlled entities. For Trump, it's the backing of the fossil fuel industry and the support of the fossil fuel industry that also pushes him to want to, to advance that fossil fuel agenda. But it's also his vision, I mean, just to sort of bring it together, of an autocracy that he sees in other leaders that he would like to emulate. And fossil fuels are a great model to do that with.
That he told us that out the gate. You're absolutely right.
He sure did.
In your article, you state that, and I'm quoting again, administrative officials have taken to calling the Alaska LNG, that's liquefied natural gas, the Alaska LNG project, the Big Beautiful Twin, a nod to the 1977 Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline on which it is modeled. Can you talk a little bit about that history?
So the Trans-Alaska Pipeline comes from another era. It comes from an era when there were people, certainly not all of them, because it was during the Carter era, when there were people who felt that we really needed to double down on fossil fuels. And it wasn't everyone, but there were certainly people who believed that. And Alaska has oil up in its North Slope, and the Alaska oil pipeline was a long, very expensive project, which built a pipeline that stretched from the North Slope of Alaska down to famously Valdez. And it was the Exxon Valdez oil tanker that was carrying oil from that pipeline that ran aground in Valdez and was one of the worst US oil disasters until the BP Deepwater Horizon oil disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. The idea for a gas pipeline to model the oil pipeline has been around at least as long as the oil pipeline, but it's been rejected time and time and time and time again as unnecessary, undesirable, increasingly expensive, increasingly not the path that the world has been on since. And at this point, whereas the oil pipeline cost $7 billion in 1977 dollars, so I'm not sure what that would be today. This pipeline is estimated, the pipeline and the rest and the big project that I talked about in Nikiski is estimated at $70 billion. So one of the things I did was talk to a lot of people around the state who have seen this process unfold from the beginning and think that it's, an entirely backwards direction to go. One of the reasons why today, sort of looking at the modern story, is that the United States now, particularly under Trump, so the United States has been for a few years the largest exporter of gas in the world. And the technical term liquefied natural gas just means when you take natural gas, which is a term we don't like to use a lot because it gives a sort of mythical idea that this is natural in the sense that it's like green energy. Natural gas is only to differentiate it from gasoline. Lots of us like to call it methane gas, which is more accurate because it's primarily composed of methane, which is a significantly more climate intensive pollutant than even CO2. So, but this term we're talking about, liquefied natural gas, is how you take that gas and liquefy it so that which is a hugely complex, extremely expensive, massive process so that you can then put it on tankers and ship it somewhere else. So the US is already the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, taking the gas that we produce here, turning it into a liquid, and shipping it off to other countries. And under Trump, that amount has increased significantly. So that last month, we hit the highest record ever. That has contributed significantly to the increase in home heating bills and electricity costs that Americans are experiencing all across the country, because while there's more gas being produced and more people are more dependent on gas, we're shipping it out in record amounts. That's reducing supply and increasing costs. But at the same time right now, and one reason why electricity costs have skyrocketed since Trump took office is not just that he's increasing the amount of gas he's shipping out of the country, but also he's kneecapping wind and solar and renewable all across the country. And that is taking cost savings that were estimated to come and erasing them and leading the suppliers of our electricity to charge us more and more and more, because now now they know, or they expect, that there won't be that new supply of renewables that they expected to come. So they're choosing to increase prices onto consumers because they were about to get all of this money from the federal government under the Biden administration, and now they're not under the Trump administration. And they also don't expect future investment from the Trump administration. So all that's being passed on to you and I in the form of significantly higher electricity costs. So this proposal for Alaska is to double down on that same process, spend more money on a massive fossil fuel operation, export it out of the country, and pitch it to Americans is in our best interest.
Also, he can join the autocrat club.
And join the autocrat club. Stay double down in his path towards a desired autocracy.
You write about veteran Alaskan investigative journalist and author Stan Jones. And Jones wrote a report called Alaska's Pointless Pipe Dream, was sponsored by a coalition of Alaskan environmental groups organizing against the project. Can you talk about why this pipeline is considered pointless by a significant number of Alaskans?
Yeah, and I'll say that, and Stan would be the first to point this out, and he's a great journalist. He also wrote a wonderfully important book, an oral history on the Exxon Valdez disaster, which I highly recommend for folks who want to understand the significance of that event. And there's still oil, by the way, if you go to beaches in Valdez, there's still oil coming up on those beaches from the Exxon Valdez disaster so many decades later. I basically tell my story as much as possible, the reporting through this story, with following Native Alaskans in the work that they're leading across the state in their resistance and organizing. And they are, of course, joined by and supported by many non-Native, longtime residents and multi-generational residents of Alaska. But I think it's critically important to highlight the incredible leadership of the Native Alaskan communities. So I just want to highlight that, and then I know that we will talk about those experts and Native Alaskans who I had the great opportunity to interview and learn from
Yeah,
and
those
report
questions
on.
are on my list.
Yeah, I
Yes.
figured. But turning to Stan Jones, who did this great report. And also just to, I guess, also to highlight, it's not just environmental groups that are opposing the pipeline. There certainly are environmental groups that are opposing the pipeline, but they're not alone. They're in coalition with groups that are concerned about their pocketbooks, the economy, the politics of it, the division that it creates within the state when those who are working on advancing renewable, regenerative forms of building the economy are having so much success. And people who care about jobs and workers are organizing against it. And I'm sure we'll talk about this, but that includes former oil worker who I interviewed, and um, but and environmentalists and conservationists, because the environment of Alaska is so intimately tied to the lives and livelihoods of Alaskans. Of course, anyone who has seen any footage from Alaska can appreciate, but being there is just a whole another experience. It's mostly just this stunning, incredibly beautiful, environment, and people reliant and dependent on that stunning, beautiful environment, and tourists who want to come and enjoy that stunning, beautiful environment, and an economy that is built on a stunning, beautiful environment. And so, one of the reasons for opposing this pipeline is that it would cut an 800-mile long line across the state through the pipeline, but also be reliant on continued and increased production of oil and gas on the North Slope, carry that down where that production is already having harm on local communities and the environment, and of course the climate. Profits are dependent upon a continuation of that production. And if you build this $70 billion project that is an oil pipeline and the export facility and a terminal, you have a lot of money invested in making sure that that gas keeps flowing. Just like right now, there's a lot of money invested in making sure that oil keeps flowing. So locking in that dependence on fossil fuels. I've reported on oil and gas development in Louisiana, and I've seen in Louisiana what these mammoth liquefied natural gas operations look like. And it's hard to describe it. It's even hard to realize when you look at it in pictures what it's like until you're in front of them. I've been reporting on oil and gas issues for decades, and I've seen operations all over the world. And there's nothing that compares to the scale of these operations. And that's because it's such an intensive process to transfer and convert that gas, which is a gas, into a liquid, and then the size of the ships that then have to carry it around. And it wouldn't, I guess, surprise people after hearing about this to learn that one of the problems with fossil fuels is that one of the main uses of fossil fuels is to produce and move fossil fuels. You have to produce so much of it because you have to use so much of it to produce it and use it. And it's one of the main drawbacks of fossil fuels versus renewables is that renewables don't work that way, right? Renewables are much more easy and efficient and less expensive and less energy consuming to produce and use and move around. But fossil fuels consume an enormous amount of fossil fuels to move and consume. And so that's another reason of opposition. And then finally, I'll just say, on the list of reasons for opposition is making this time and energy and investment in this project means that money and time and energy investment isn't going into renewables. And estimates for the state of Alaska, like the nation, are that renewable energy is slated to create significantly more jobs and financial savings than are fossil fuels. And in the state of Alaska, it's something like 5 times the amount of jobs could be created by shifting to renewable energy than staying reliant on fossil fuels.
I want to talk about jobs a little more in a minute. But one thing that intrigued me about what Sam Jones said is he said it's such a petroculture up here politically that I just take it for granted that anyone who's from Alaska and wants to get reelected has to go along with it. So, do you have any idea of the number of Alaskans who support this rededication to fossil fuel versus the number of those who support rededicating to renewable energy? Why are these people getting reelected, in other words?
Well, there's 2 questions. So one is there's a lot of money from the fossil fuel industry that's going into campaigns. And so elected officials, so for example, at the federal level, ConocoPhillips alone, which is the largest producer in Alaska, is the single largest contributor to federal campaigns, significantly more than any other single entity in Alaska to federal campaigns. And Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski, who's the ranking politician in the state, her single largest campaign contributor over her entire career is ConocoPhillips. So the petroculture that Stan is referencing is really about money. But Alaskans, I'm told, probably on the whole, support this project because right now the state is dependent on fossil fuels. Right now, people's homes are dependent on gas and they're running out of gas domestically. Right now, that's a sector that people also get direct payments from. Alaska is a state where where the industry is taxed when it produces oil and gas, and that money goes into a general fund that every single Alaskan gets money out of. And in Native communities, that can be a huge amount of money. They also, in Native communities, many also are shareholders in companies that are invested in the fossil fuel industry. And so it probably is a very high number of Alaskans that support the project because right now that's what's in front of them. And they're seeing this project as a way of supporting something that already exists. But what I heard from, for example, Nori Simmons, who's a Native Alaskan who worked in the oil industry in the North Slope for 7 years, and now runs what's it called? Sovereign Inupiaq for a Living Arctic is the name of the organization that she's executive director of, which is working to transition off of fossil fuels. She said that she believes that most people in Native communities oppose fossil fuels, but say it quietly because there's real ramifications for saying that publicly. But what they really want is the money and energy and resources. They don't care about fossil fuels per se. They just want to make sure that they have the security that they and their families need. And that if that could come from a cleaner, safer, more efficient source, they would absolutely prefer that. And that she thinks that's certainly the majority of Native Alaskans that she knows and Native Alaskans at large. And other people I spoke to said sort of similarly for the state that people aren't wed to fossil fuels, they're wed to the security that currently comes from it. Although that security, of course, for those who are particularly concerned about the climate crisis in Alaska, which is causing fires, floods, eliminating for many food security, water security, the climate crisis is costing so much money and causing so much insecurity that quote unquote stability from the fossil fuel industry is not there. But to say, what do the majority of Alaskans think? What I was told was that basically this financial dependence on the industry is really something that takes a lot to overcome. And that's going to require support to transition off of fossil fuels so that there is that energy. There's a new energy that's being provided and there's a new economy that's being provided, which is, by the way, what the Biden administration was supporting with providing federal funds for the transition.
Let's talk about jobs for a while. It seems like the petroculture is saying that the big beautiful twin is going to bring lots of jobs to Alaska, but do you question that reality?
Yeah, so this was, it's a great interview that Nori Simmons, who lives on the North Slope, the Native Alaskan who I had mentioned, had been an oil worker. And she said first, just she told me in her experience, one of the problems with the fossil fuel industry in Alaska is that so many of those who are working in the industry are not even coming from Alaska. Her experience was that it was a vast majority. She guessed, say 90% of the oil workers in the state in the North Slope were not from Alaska. The official figures for the state are 50% in the North Slope do not come from Alaska. So it's not creating Alaska jobs, and that there has been a growth in the industry, but the growth of jobs is coming from outside. But even within that sort of lack of job creation for Alaskans, the industry as a whole only employs at most 3% of jobs in the state. And that number is likely, and that number is generous because that's the entire mining sector, of which fossil fuels are only a part. The jobs being promised are also not are a promise that you can't necessarily bank on, because the fossil fuel industry has been shedding jobs for years. One, just to make itself more efficient, but also it's increasingly turning to AI and to automated machinery to replace workers. And this year, ConocoPhillips, which is the largest oil producer in the state, has said that globally it's going to reduce its workforce by 25%. Shell has said 20%. All of the major producers in Alaska, but also all of the major oil companies that we know the names of, Exxon and others, have said that they're going to do more job cuts this year globally, just like they did last year, just like they've been doing for years. This is an industry that is shrinking in jobs. And the promises of job protection in Alaska that the Trump administration has made are in the thousands, as opposed to the tens of thousands, some 60,000 that would be available in the renewable energy sector if the state shifted. And that, again, is similar nationally, that you see a shrinking fossil fuel industry where jobs tend to be temporary. So you would have jobs, temporary jobs in construction of the pipeline, for example, but that would just be for the length of time that that construction took. Construction of the facility, temporary jobs. And that those numbers are getting smaller. And so it's not a sector of booming jobs as opposed to the renewable energy sector, which is and has been booming.
What about the materials that the pipeline would be built from? Where do they come from?
Yeah, the maker of this, or the person who, sorry, the company that owns Glen Farm Group, which owns 75% of this project, said in a statement that they would be primarily supplying the pipeline with South Korean steel. When I asked them about that, they said that they would be looking at potentially U.S. steel makers, but that basically it would not be a made in America pipeline.
That's no surprise. But I wanted it said.
Yeah.
And so aside from the resistance, which we'll focus on in just a moment, what other roadblocks face the pipeline?
Yeah, so I see what you're getting at. I'm sorry. I'm like the definition of roadblock is resistance, but okay, got it. So yeah, it's I think as I mentioned in the beginning, it's Um, economically incredibly expensive. The US is already producing all of this LNG. It's up in Alaska, as opposed to where most of the, and unfortunately for the residents of Louisiana and Texas, most of the build out is taking place down there, much to the opposition of many Texas and Louisiana communities. But, it's environmentally incredibly complex to build a pipeline in the Arctic. It's 800 miles is an extremely long pipeline. They don't have guaranteed buyers. The Trump administration has been pushing and pushing and pushing this project. Trump pushed it in 2017. He even went to China, and he and the president of China were in the People's Hall in Beijing, and they overlooked a ceremony where an Alaskan delegation signed an agreement for this pipeline with the Chinese. That didn't go anywhere. Trump is now saying that the Japanese are ready to sign a deal for this project. The Japanese are saying, "Whoa, hold on, not so fast. We're not committed to this." There doesn't seem to be the type of interest that Trump wants in it, but that doesn't mean it necessarily won't happen. So there are a lot of roadblocks in terms of its economy, its scale. One of the things I talk about in the article is that sort of natural gas experts have said they're pretty doubtful that it will happen, but that doesn't stop Trump from pushing it and believing that it will happen and trying to make it happen.
That surprised me that
Yeah.
so many people globally think it is a pipe dream, as well as the resistance within Alaska.
Yeah, and I think that's because of this, just there's an overabundance of gas being produced and exported in the world, more than the expected um, consumption, but some of the resistance is I mean some of the global lack of interest has to do, unfortunately, sort of, I mean, for those who want to make sure that we transition off of fossil fuels, has to do with the difficulties of doing this project in Alaska from scratch, where there's other places that are easier to do it. And again, that's not easy on the people that live in those places, but it sort of bends the arc towards a preference for those other places than doing it in some places complex and expensive um, as Alaska.
That makes sense. So you mentioned Nori Simmons, but I wanted to talk a little more about her organization, Sovereign Inupiat for Living Arctic. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
Uh, can you tell us a little bit about the organization that she's running?
Yeah, so she's one of several incredible Native leaders and Native women who I had the opportunity to interview who are from throughout Alaska. And uh, Sovereign Nupiaq for Living Arctic is organized in the North Slope to really provide a safe space for those in the community who want to protect their native culture, their native environment, their native ways. And one of the ways to do that is challenging oil and gas development. And they have been doing that in the North Slope where they live. They have been working with allies across the state, including in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, to really try and create a space for those who are um, concerned about voicing the opposition within the Native community to have a safe space to go and to stand up and to show that there isn't, as is sometimes portrayed, sort of a belief that there's a monolithic support for oil and gas within Native communities that are economically reliant on it, to show that that's not true, that there are those within the Native communities who know that there is, to use Nori's words in my article, know that there is a future in renewables that is lucrative, that is superior to oil and gas, and is much more healthy and much more sustaining for Native Alaskans. And their organization, SCILA is the acronym, as I said, is working with other organizations to make sure that that voice is heard, and doing so in providing testimony and documentation and writing to federal hearings and newspapers and outlets, and just doing really great creative work. When I was in Alaska in 2015, when President Obama, when the Shell was getting ready to start producing oil off the Arctic, I interviewed Nuri's aunt, who was leading opposition to offshore oil and gas coming to the Arctic successfully, because not too long thereafter, President Obama banned all Arctic offshore drilling, with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau doing the same in Canada. And that is something that Trump is trying to tried to undo in 2017. Biden put it back into place, is trying to undo again now. But there is generations of Native communities who are resisting.
That's a wonderful lineage.
Yeah.
So there's also Eneba Gay, and she is the executive director of Alaska's Native Movement. And she's involved in something called the Art in Action camps, which look pretty interesting. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Native Movement is the name of the organization, and it is in Alaska, which is why I wrote it that way. And Eneba Gay co-founded the organization some 20 years ago with her partner, who at that time was the chief of his Gwich'in community. And they have been organizing to support grassroots efforts across the state to, again, protect sovereignty, to protect Native ways of living and life and subsistence living, and to protect themselves from continued oil and gas development and to help transition to non-extractive, sustainable ways of producing energy and a sustainable economy, regenerative economies. And they're part of a network of it's called the Just Transition Network of groups across Alaska. And one of the things they organize is training camps for organizers across the state and also action camps. And that's helping pull people together from across the state to do training and to do arts in action and to come together as communities to further their collaborative work and coming together collaboratively.
And speaking of lineage, I found this really helpful. You write that 8 young Alaskans, ranging in age from 11 to 22, are suing to stop the project. It's Sagunik versus State of Alaska, and it argues that Alaska's constitution does not allow the state to prioritize fossil fuels above the health, safety, cultures, and future of Alaska's youth who are already experiencing profound harms from the climate crisis, bringing flooding, wildfires, and food and water security. What do you think will happen with this lawsuit?
Yeah, I thought that was a wonderful lawsuit as well. And I interviewed one of the plaintiffs, a young woman who is just turned 21 and who has been Linnea Letfer is her name. Make sure I'm getting her name right. That's right. Who's been she's a third generation Alaskan, and she has been organizing against fossil fuels since she was 12. So for the majority of her life, at the age of 12, she entered into her first climate lawsuit as a plaintiff. Um, and she helped organize her college campus to divest from fossil fuels successfully. She's a writer, she's an organizer, and now she is on a plaintiff on this lawsuit as well, as is Ine Begay's 18-year-old daughter. They are arguing that Alaska has a constitution that says you can't put fossil fuels first, that we are suffering extreme consequences of the climate crisis already. And they're only going to get worse. And there is a solution. We need to stop advancing fossil fuel projects. And the Alaska LNG project would be a significant contributor to the continued climate crisis. And so the lawsuit right now is they are appealing the most recent ruling by a judge to keep this lawsuit going. But even if this lawsuit doesn't continue, they're committed to their work to stop the project and to stop fossil fuels from advancing in the state. It's part of the Children's Trust series of suits that have brought suits on behalf of youths who are not just looking towards future harm, but experiencing, the harms today of the climate crisis and harms that they did not contribute to. And so it's a critically important suit, that I thought was important to bring to discuss in the piece.
So, Antonia, what would you recommend to the audience here that to keep tabs on this issue moving forward? What organizations, and follow you, of course, but where should they go to find out more as events unfold?
Yeah, one of the other groups, one of the other Native leaders who I spoke to, her organization is Grandmothers Growing Goodness. And that's another one of the organizations that has been leading this work along with Native Movement and Sovereign Inupiaq for a Living Arctic. And then it's many of the names of organizations that you would expect to hear. There's the Sierra Club, there's the 350 Juneau, there's also a group called Fairbanks Climate Action, I believe is their name. And those are many of the groups that are doing this work in the state. Lawsuits are being led by Earth Justice, Children's Trust, the Alaska Wilderness League. The person, Andy Madero, who took me out to see the melting Lawrence Glacier was with Alaska Wilderness League. And then there's Cook Inlet Keeper, which is a small local organization in Nikiski. And Ben Bodiger was the person with Cook Inlet Keeper who showed me around Nikiski where this massive plant would be built. Experts like Stan Jones and Larry Persili, who I interview in the piece. And to say that these groups are also connected to national movements. And of course, this isn't just about Alaska. And of course, my reporting isn't just about Alaska. My reporting covers the country and the world. And this is what's taking place in Alaska for Trump is a almost controlled test case for what he's also, of course, trying to do nationally through law and policy. And aligning himself, as I said, internationally with allies internationally. And the good news is that even while he pushes his practice beyond what I think most of us even expected, for example, with his speech this week in front of 800 military leaders saying that the war is from within and that they needed to be prepared to fight essentially a war against US citizens, that the guardrails, while there are this time, the difference with this Trump administration versus the previous Trump administration is that the internal guardrails are no longer there. He doesn't have people within the administration who are acting as guardrails against his actions. But the guardrails from outside are still there. And we're still there. The journalists are still there. The advocates and activists are still there. The people who just care enough to show up are still there. The lawyers are still there. The judges are still there. And that work of engagement, what I really appreciated from those that I interviewed in Alaska was they were saying the work that they're doing is strengthening ties between communities that wouldn't otherwise necessarily, what would often be seen as adversaries, labor and environmentalists, Native communities and non-Native communities, people who are seen on the right and people who are seen on the left, who are coming together. And that organizing is creating a sense of community at the same time as Trump is working so aggressively to make us only see division and hate, in his words. He keeps saying, I hate the people on the other side, right? Genuinely declaring hate, not just acting with the military, but also demanding hate. And that in that engagement, in that coming together, we actually, that's the thing that's going to see us through this. And that was reassuring for me to see play out in Alaska, and continues to reassure me as we, watch things, as we experience the sort of toll of Trump's current reign.
Antonia Juhasz, it's been an honor and a pleasure spending this hour with you, and I hope you come back on the podcast again.
Thank you so much for having me, Carolyn. It was great to be with you.
Thanks to Antonia Juhasz for being our guest today. Her article, Inside the Fight Against Trump's Alaskan Pipe Dream, was published in Rolling Stone on September 29th. Juhasz is a regular contributing politics reporter to Rolling Stone, where she writes feature articles focusing on energy, climate, and environmental justice. You can find her at antoniajuhasz.net. Juhasz is spelled Juhaszz. That's antoniajuhasz.net. You can also support her work there with your tax-deductible contributions. That's it for the Whimsy podcast today. This podcast is produced on the sacred ancestral land of the Anishinaabe people. Thanks to the California band Castle House for writing and performing our music. Thanks to our underwriter Just Play Productions, and to our paid Patreon members for their support of today's podcast. If you'd like to offer your support, please visit my website, whimsyfarm.net, and click the Patreon link to find a level of support that's right for you. There is also a free membership level. You can email me through the website as well. That's whimsyfarm.net. The Whimsy Farm podcast airs the 1st and 15th of each month on our YouTube channel, Carolyn Crane and Whimsy Farm, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. You can find links to video, audio, Patreon. Everything's at whimsyfarm.net. Please join me on November 1st when the veil is thin. I'll celebrate Samhain with Akashic Records expert Christabeth Ingold, and Mariam Barry will return with poet Teresa Staines. Until then, remember the words of Utah Phillips, who said, "Too many good people are doing too many good things to afford me the luxury of being pessimistic." Get out there and create some positive change. Stay safe, everyone.
whimsyfarms.net